All right, there we go. Hey, everyone at home, so to speak. Just started the recording. Oh, Ethan Bill's gift, great. All right. I'm in the process of rechecking my built knowledge with much more clarity. That goes wonderful. All right, I'll get started with a few slides here. I put a lot into, I put a lot into, I haven't put the slide yet, put a lot into preparing for today and certainly all day today, but also for the last few weeks. That still doesn't mean I don't have tons of unanswered questions, right? As for myself, that I'd still love to know. There's still more to discover and so forth. I don't have closure on everything. I also don't know the exact structure as it typically is the case, but I have a great core distinction for you today and lots of great notes, at least in my notebook and so forth. So we'll see how it all comes together and so forth. All right. Hey, Janine, great to have you here as well. Excellent. All right. Let me switch what you're looking at here to the slides. Okay. So the core distinction for today and for your life, or at least either one of them, or really, in this case, it really is perhaps the core distinction that you want to have. And it's going to be cool. I'm putting this in a somewhat different way. It's certainly related to things I've talked about in the past. It'll help to tie some things together, or maybe a lot of things together, but also a bit of a different take. For those of you who've heard me talk about like success or approximation and stuff, I'm not going to use that terminology in this webinar because I'm running into a few, I don't know if it's dead ends or it might overly restrict us or cause a mental kind of scenario or something that isn't quite what I want. So, and it's also not, what I like about this distinction, the way I'm putting it today, is that it's framed in terms of opposites, which is critical, which is great, right? That makes it a different sort of thing, as we'll see. So what we're going to be organizing around today, and for as long as it takes, and we'll refer back to it throughout the Dimensionality series, is that we have a gray area process, I'll call it, and I'll say process for one in a minute, and then a black and white process. And this is something that I've been working on since I started with this over a couple decades ago. And when I say process, this is a little bit like if you've heard me in the past say there's really one question, right? With a number of facets or angles to it, but there's a basic question in life of what's going on. There's a whole bunch of questions that kind of point to one question: what's really going on? Who are we and how do we interact with the world? How do we become successful and happy? How do we get results? How do we know what's true? What is our free will? What does it consist of? And how does that relate to that, or that must relate to what our actual power is, to whatever power we do have to increase the quality of our own lives or other people's lives? What is that? How does it work? How do we interact with the world? What's our leverage point? How do we think? What's the relation between us and our minds? How does consciousness fit in? That was rapid fire there, but you probably got some sense or already had some sense of all those really relate, and they're really, in essence, boil down to the same question, right? And again, I can't pick one of those and say that's the question, but there's a way that all those words and questions point to one central thing. And that's our real question in life, right? That's our real issue. One of the things we'll see is as we start to explore this distinction, we're going to see that the gray area really forms a kind of circular situation where people tend to think that it's all there is, and they think that maximizing it is the only thing you can do in life. And we're going to see how a lot of success philosophy and success advice end up being maximizing gray area stuff without really understanding or taking advantage of this distinction itself. What we really want to do is not just maximize one or how we operate in the gray area, because if we do that with a gray area approach, then we're actually doing something wrong right after that. In other words, there's some black and white stuff. There's some definite things we can know about how to operate most optimally in areas of life where we can't know for sure what to do. So when we have to fumble around or successfully approximate or work our way to a solution where it's not certain, it can't be figured out just by thinking about it, there's still ways we can operate that we can know are correct. Just to give you something tangible to relate to for a moment. If we think of the scientific method, which is basically you form a hypothesis, right? Or you, based on observations, which you might have just accidentally made, or you might have gone out and on purpose collected data, right? Either way, one way or the other, observations were made, right? Inputs were received from the world, and then a hypothesis was formed, right? A statement that may or may not be true. And then you would go out and test it. And there's ways that you can test it with like double blind things, trying to only have one variable, right? Things like there's vocabulary or words or ideas, like having a control and then switching one thing, right, in your experiment. And then you test the hypothesis, right? You want to make predictions based on the hypothesis typically and see if those predictions turn out to be correct after collecting feedback from the world, right? After doing experiments and seeing how they turn out. And so that's all basic description of the scientific method. Now, as I just did that, the idea of how to properly carry out the scientific method, like the scientific method itself as described, not doing it, but method itself, much or all of it can be figured out that it has to be correct based on just clear thinking or a black and white process where you actually know all the relevant information and you, in a way that's analogous mathematically, you figure out, yeah, it has to be this way. You form a hypothesis, because what if you didn't have a hypothesis? If you had no hypothesis, you couldn't go to the next step, which is testing it, right? And then how would you test it? Do you want to change a whole bunch of things at once and then not know which of those factors was important, or et cetera? So the truth about the right process itself for the scientific method is actually not discovered through science. The scientific method itself is not scientific. It's not science. The scientific method describes what to do in certain gray area situations about discovering and figuring out how the physical world works. Figuring out how the physical world works is a gray area, right? We don't have enough knowledge of every single factor. We're not aware of it all in such clear detail that we can figure it out in a kind of logical, mathematical, whatever, black and white process. And so we have to explore it and get feedback and approximate, but try to narrow down the approximation so that the margin of error is smaller, and then even reporting on the margin of error, right, as part of what you might do and do a statistical analysis and so. So I'm using this as an example. I'm not talking about the scientific method as a topic here, but I'm talking about it as illustrating, as discussing the distinction for today. So the scientific method, what the scientific method is developed through accurate thinking, the black-white process. And not that you should know every detail of that, either one yet. We're exploring both the gray area process and the black and white process, right? So it isn't that you should have full knowledge of either one yet, but I'm just discussing it now. So this is part of discussing it. So a black and white process can be used to outline or boundary or delineate what the scientific process should be. And then the process itself is how to operate inside of a gray area. On a related note, something I mentioned before is that David Hume, right, the philosopher, I think in the 1700s, and at this point, I might be wrong on the date, but he came up with an idea that had a pretty funny error related to this, in that he said that the way that you shouldn't declare that something's true. I'm paraphrasing, and maybe I'm being unfair, but I don't think I am. But I'm still, the concept I'm illustrating is independent of David Hume, and he can't sue me for libel at this point since he's gone, or slander, or whatever it would be, slander. Anyhow, he came up with the idea that, or popularized perhaps the idea that if it's not tangible, if you can't hold it with your hands, if you can't perform science on it, basically, you can't do an experiment on it, right? This kind of is one of the fathers, we could say, of the scientific materialist worldview, which is a very ironic, ultimately silly worldview, because the statement itself of scientific materialism, again, which is the idea that you can't know something unless you can do an experiment on it, form it with your hands, touch it, tangible, right? That kind of thing. That idea itself doesn't pass its own test. So that's ironic there. So what's going on at the core of our lives is an idea of how to make progress. I'm skipping down here a little bit, but if you think about it, then your happiness and of course, and your results, including any specific result you want to get, including certainly making money, right, and making an online business, et cetera, revolves around the idea of progress and how you deal with it, how you come up with how correct or incorrect you are regarding how to make progress, such as with an online business, right? A person who's successful will, at some point, identify to either good degree or a great degree or perfect degree or whatever, a way to make and measure their progress. In doing so, they will tend to feel happier while doing it and even get into a flow state and so. So if we have mistakes regarding our ability to identify, measure, and make progress and so forth, then all kinds of issues pop up. Basically, you feel stuck in some way, right? And actually, all negative emotions are some formula relating to getting stuck, right? Boredom is when you feel like you can't make progress towards any of your goals in a particular situation. Frustration is when you feel blocked by the environment, but it's no one's fault, right? I've mentioned some of these before. Anger is when you feel like you can't make progress because of someone's intentional interference or their negligence, and you feel angry. Anger generally has to be directed towards a person, perhaps including yourself. Frustration is when the same type of thing happens, but there's no personality involved in your mind, in your perception. Fear is when your mind thinks of a situation where it's associated with negative progress, which then would relate to pain, right? Emotional or physical. And then it gets stuck right there and doesn't work how you're going to work through that and then make progress. And then it gives you fear for that situation, as I described in the fear video. Shame is rooted in the idea that you should have done something different in the past. I didn't relate that exactly to the word progress, but you basically have a goal for the past for you to have done something different in the past. And it involves being stuck because, as I said, negative emotions, they revolve around being stuck. And you're also stuck because you can't change the past. So it's very disempowering. You want to change the past and you can't. So stuck in that negative emotion. So showing you the opposite view there, where negative emotions are always traceable to being stuck plus some other factors that color which negative emotion you feel. And you can actually basically eliminate negative emotions through not having the conditions where you believe that you're stuck. If it's the case that negative emotions come out around being stuck, then it can give us a hint that the idea of making progress is some form of happiness. We could say pleasure, joy, and we can give different words or different concepts to positive emotions, hope, right? And we can actually make formulas for each of those that all revolve around progress, if you wanted to, right? Hope is the hope that like the belief that we can make progress towards some goal, right? Then we're picturing that, then we have hope, right? I haven't worked through all these exactly myself, but even off the top of my head, joy, there might be two different types of joy. One might involve helping another person make progress, right? There might be something else, which we might not use the exact word joy, or we might, in common usage terms, words have multiple usages, right? So there's no such thing as pinning down what a word means perfectly in common in usage. But there's also a positive emotion associated with the idea of where you have a breakthrough and all of a sudden your ability to make progress is you feel like a whole new burst or advantage or ability or breakthrough or building block or relationship, something that's going to give you a big advantage or breakthrough in making progress. And that who knows what the usage of that, something related to joy or elation, right? So we might call it whatever. A general feeling of happiness is if you look and you generally take a look at some form of measuring your progress and feel like it's generally unblocked and you've been doing well with it in the recent past and coming up in the reasonably foreseeable future. Not really looking too long term, but happiness is probably mostly related to taking a look at a fairly close past and fairly close future and feeling like you've both made progress and will continue to make, right? That feeling. And then pleasure would be about something that is associated with making progress and your brain associates that and stimulates your pleasure center. You feel pleasure, right? You could feel both pleasure, joy, and hope, perhaps, if you had all three things work together. If something innately pleasurable also felt like and at the same time, you felt like you've been making progress and we're going to make it. And at the same time, you felt like there was a new building block or breakthrough. You might feel like elation, happiness, and pleasure at the same time. Or you could feel pleasure, but also feel a bunch of negative emotions because you're eating something nice. But at the same time, you feel like you're stuck in a whole bunch of ways and your mind's focused on it, right? So you could have mixed emotions depending on those same formulas being triggered off. So right there, that probably pretty fascinating in and of itself that I described that for you. But also it shows how progress or being stuck is central to not just your emotions, of course, but to actual results, right? Certainly, it's pretty obvious at the minute we think about it. I've talked about this, I think, before. if you can be assured to make progress and not get stuck, including stuck where make real progress where you're not running in circles, where you're making genuine progress towards a particular result without getting stuck, then you're going to reach it, right? If we stipulate you're not going to get stuck, including where you're running, but running in circles or trapped at an island, right? If those things are not going to happen, then you'll get to your results. Any supposed counterexample to that would just be disguising you get stuck, right? What if you die before it happens? You got stuck, right? That sort of thing. What if you get diverted off your path and you're not making progress? I said, or you're getting diverted to where you get stuck. Because if you get diverted, but then you realize you got diverted at some point and you get back on track, then you will reach your goal. And if you get diverted and don't realize you got diverted, then you got stuck. So once again, pretty much, even if we try to look at counterexamples, they end up dissolving. And we end up where you're going to get results in life. Even if you say, I don't care about happiness, David, don't want to hear about happiness. I just want to get results. I just need money. I don't need to be happy. Then the fact is that it's all boiled down to the exact same thing, right? And emotions and result end up being tied together in a way that it's worthwhile to understand them both. If you try to ignore feelings on the way to a result, depending on how you interpret that, that can be helpful, but mostly it's you're running upstream or swimming upstream. And it's only going to help to understand both simultaneously. But of course, anyone that just really focused on results and everything I'm talking about is completely efficient and effective for just that. All right. What I'm here on this bottom line here in order to give some context to what I'm talking about. So I wrote your success and happiness revolve around your mind's process for measuring progress, right? So in order to measure progress, you have to have some sense of what progress is, and then some sense of figuring out whether you're making it, right? And that process, if you think about, okay, so if our mind is going to figure out what constitutes real progress, right? It needs to have an idea of what goals are around, which necessitates understanding context, having a framework for things. I need to learn. I need to gain knowledge. I need to make decisions. I need to think, right? So really everything to do with your mind gets subsumed or is related. Once we talk about a mind making progress or your process for identifying and measuring progress, then we're really looking at your process for everything to do with thinking and acting, because they're all related to progress, right? Again, thinking, deciding, knowing, learning, decision-making, deciding involved taking action, understanding, all of it boils down to the same thing, right? Or those different words, which have different concepts, they all point logically related where you can't remove any one of them, right? From this, whatever this one concept is. And that's the whole concept I'm talking about when I talk about your process, right? Your process is your process for knowing, your process for learning. Learning is a subset of all this. Thinking is a subset, but they're subsets of your process for, it's all necessary for goal achievement, figuring out what goals to achieve in the first place, right? If you just can achieve goals, but you achieve the wrong goals, then you're actually not making progress. You're not getting results that are going to help you, and you're going to end up screwed, right? So there's no such thing as just being intelligent or in the sense of just achieving goals without that same process effectively figuring out what to actually shoot for. So we're right back to how do we figure out the right type of progress to make, the right direction, so to speak, and how to make it, right? What constitutes progress and in both to start out and to keep going. Again, so we keep ending up in the same place. And all of the other concepts, thinking, deciding, knowing, learning, are all subsumed in this one overall process. And so I need to describe all that in order for you to understand this critical word of what I mean by process here. Because once we have the context of what I mean by our process, right? Fundamentally what you do, how your mind thinks, it's all related, all one thing. Then there's something absolutely critical. And when I deal with other people and watch them operate and so forth, they don't have a clear distinction between that. There's actually two very different processes for the same overall thing, right? The same overall idea of navigating your life, right? Thinking, deciding, achieving goals, everything to do with making progress. It's like if you've listened to alchemy and I talked about berries, the idea that there can be berries that look alike, but there's actually two different types of berries if you don't realize it, and one of them is poisonous, one of them is healthy, then you conclude that all of your conclusions about berries involve both. Oh, they keep me alive, but they make me sick, and so forth. It turns out that if you make a distinction, you can actually see something you didn't see before that distinguishes the two berries. Now you can stay away from, in that illustration, you can stay away from the poisonous ones, just eat the healthy ones. In this case, if we change that metaphor slightly, then in this case, there's not poisonous berries and good berries in terms of the gray area process and black and white process. They're both critical. They're both great if they're used at the right time. So if we change that analogy to be like to say that you needed one of the types of berries at a certain time, right? Such as at night or what, right? When you're thirsty, who cares, right? When you're alkaline versus acidic, but whatever it might be, if you imagine that you need to have one of the berries at the right time, and if you eat the wrong one at the wrong time, or the wrong one at the right time, but then it would be the wrong one, then you'd be relatively screwed, and vice versa, right? So if it was critical that you eat one berry in certain situations and the other berry in the opposite type of situation, and there was only two types of situation. If we stipulate something ridiculous, but if we just stipulate it that if before noon, your time you are in the world, you had to eat one type of berries or you'd be screwed if it was magic and you had to eat the other type afternoon, then it would be critical to understand that whole situation, understand about berries, understand about the distinction, the time of day, and so forth. And in essence, that's what's going on with these two processes that are distinct and different and have different properties and qualities and need to be used at different times. There's all sorts of times in life when you cannot know the answer, such as the exact structure, the exact words to say on this webinar, right? Or the right words to put on which slides in the right order. I can't know that, so that's a gray area. And there's a certain way of operating in that gray area. On the other hand, the fact of this distinction, the reality of this distinction is something that can be known in a black and white way. That understanding this distinction is a black and white thing, and I can know it or I cannot know it. In this case, I know it. And I don't arrive at it through the gray area process. I don't use that process on something that can be known with the black and white process because, first of all, the gray area process won't necessarily arrive at the right answer. And even if it did, I wouldn't know it was the right answer after I got to it. You can't know anything for certain with the gray area process. It doesn't give that type of result. So depending on how you frame the question, you can get virtually anyone to say, you can't know anything for sure. That's not true. There's a lot of stuff you can know for sure. But if they're thinking about the gray area process, that's true. You can't know anything for certain with this certain type of process, such as not what the scientific method is, but applying the scientific method to the world to discover things about it. You don't come up with certain knowledge. Even the supposed law of gravity, we don't know for sure that the law of gravity will be in effect tomorrow or that's even in effect everywhere in the world right now. We don't know that for sure. We don't see any clear violations of it, perhaps, but it doesn't lead to absolute knowledge. Because that's the case, people sometimes conclude that you can't have absolute knowledge about things. That's totally wrong. And it would entail having to assert or affirm that you don't know that rape is wrong. That, of course, no one in our culture presumably would affirm that, including myself, of course. So as soon as we say we can know things, and there must be some other process besides a process that can never lead to anything that we know for absolutely for certain. And ironically, again, the scientific process itself, knowing what it is not arrived at through science. The scientific method didn't get discovered through testing it through science. It got discovered through thinking accurately. It turns out that people do use, and this is actually something I just recently have the clarity on this, that since the last time I talked to you. I haven't talked to you since. I have additional clarity on this. The black and white process, something we might call the method, whatever, that I've talked about in the past, but it is used by people and pretty much everyone. However, their outer frame is generally dictated, or pretty much always as far as I can tell, but still a gray area. I don't know how everyone thinks or what everyone does. As far as I can tell, however, people, perhaps you guys who've been working with me, some of you accepted, but the gray area forms it's false, but it forms the foundation and the outer frame of their understanding of life, and several other frames too. But so the things that they can figure out through black and white, correct, accurate thinking, where they can actually know certain things, are, and this is a new thought that I haven't shared before, that it's framed or dictated by the gray area process. And that's not the way life should be. It's necessary and understandable that we start out that way. Take a look at the issue that our mind faces, so to speak, in helping us get started from infancy. So things get started with a gray area process when you're an infant. And then because we don't really know what's going on, it gives us a kind of starter foundation, but it's not a real foundation. Our mind basically fabricates a sense of foundationalism, or we use the word reality. We don't use the word foundationalism. But if you think about what you really mean when you just commonly in everyday speech use the word real or reality, you actually mean foundational. Not that it's based on nothing. That would defeat the common usage of the term reality. Someone says, is that real? Or come on, pay attention to reality. They're really meaning something that has its own kind of basic existence that forms like a floor that is stable and you can stand on, metaphor. What your mind does by default, helping you start out, is to create a sense of that, a sense of realness. Think about you're a mind for a second, and you're the mind of a small child, and hardly matters, but say you're the mind of a small child. Imagine what you're dealing with is there's basically just a bunch of light waves and sound waves, right, and stuff like that. There's electromagnetic interactions with your fingers and so forth with the environment. But whatever, we can just think about light, sight, and sound for a moment. There's light waves and sound waves, and that's it. There's just a whole bunch of those. And the mind creates a sense of reality out of that, like a real hard physical world, right, out of that. I don't know how well I'm communicating this issue that it's dealing with, but actually it's kind of easy to see with the tactile, right, with the hardness of the physical world. Your mind takes objects both visually and kinesthetically, right, with like tactile. If you like bang on your desk or something, like I'm knocking on my desk, it makes it feel like solid, right? But it's only solid in a certain way. In another way, as I've mentioned many times, as we all know, it's mostly empty space, right? Like over 99% empty space if you get down to an atomic level. So it creates a sense of solidity, reality to the world. It creates this kind of sharp sense of color in things, where color doesn't reside in physical objects, right? They're just differently absorbed, different wavelengths of light, right? And at least one model of the world. That's how it works. And yet it gives things a sense of color, and your mind often creates a sense of sharp edges, clear edges. I don't mean sharp like it cuts you, but clear contrast, where there's less of a clear contrast in what the original inputs are. It causes certain distinctions, a sense of reality, and so forth. I don't want to get too far into that right now, but the basic idea is that as we come to explore this gray area process, we're going to, one of the beautiful or amazing things is as we come to notice how, we have a powerful and too powerful, false sense of reality from it. And when we see how it works and understand how it works, then I'm using the word see and understand in the previous sentence, just in commonly, not like a deep meaning of either one. But as we see more how the gray area process works, we'll stop assigning a level of reality to it that is very unhelpful. Because here's what happens is, why does the gray area process why does it basically intimidates us? When we have our own minds intimidate us or keep us from exploring answers that we could figure out, it keeps us from giving enough credence or weight to things that we can figure out in a black and white certain way. because we have these feelings that come from the gray area process. We don't need to ignore our feelings, but what we need to do is not be intimidated in a certain way by the conclusions of our mind and other people's minds. Extremely, right? We don't usually put things in the terms of intimidation, and our mind doesn't tell us that we're being intimidated when we often are. But in the way that I look at the world, I see it a lot, and I purposely try to counteract it in OMG, and to a greater or lesser degree of success, depending on how much other people fight me on it. But certainly in the way that I operate, I'm on purpose trying to counteract a certain sense of intimidation that suppresses people's ability to think for themselves in a certain way. And it's subtle. It's not something that people are generally clear on, although I'm trying to explain it now or give you the context to understand it now. So the black and white process there's only certain things you can really know through thinking about them in a clear way. But there's a lot more than people realize, even like I've talked about, like God exists and so forth, right? I've talked about how people can know that taxation is just wrong, that any individual property rights violation is just wrong. And actually people can understand even basic morality in terms of individual property rights. Normally people's morality sometimes violates individual property rights, and other times it bleeds over into all sorts of things that are not immoral. And it's very constricting for somebody, right? Even they can have issues of making money, right? They feel like it's immoral to make too much money or to buy things that they like because if they have a root idea of scarcity that got formed in their gray area approximation of the world, where they got messages of scarcity at a young age, where there's only so much good stuff. And as soon as that gets believed without realizing it, then it must mean that if you have good stuff, you're taking it from someone else, right? You're taking it from a fixed pool, a fixed pie. And if you have it, necessarily someone else doesn't. And also if there's a fixed pie, people don't think there could be waste, right? So they don't worry, they'll operate in all sorts of wasteful ways and not feel like that's wrong, be hurting them or other people, because they don't see it. They don't see waste as even possible, weirdly enough, because if the pie is fixed, if they have less, other people have more. If they have more, other people have less. Again, they don't think about it in those terms. They just get the feeling of it, or it's an association that's in their mind. Everyone has enough information to actually figure out that has to be wrong using the proper black and white process of clear, accurate thinking. Everyone could, so why don't they? In one manner of looking at it, the only reason people wouldn't figure something like that out, everyone's wise enough to. Anyone who's basically has any sort of, or virtually anyone is able to. The reason they're not is they're intimidated by their associations, their feelings, other people's feelings, their norms. What they wouldn't call it intimidation. We can call it arrogance, a feeling of certainty, but it's just there. They feel like the world is scarce and they don't know why, but that feeling is strong enough that they don't question it. Whatever word you want to put to that. But I like calling it intimidation. They're intimidated by their own mind. All sorts of times when you think that you're confident, when your mind gives you a feeling of confidence and conclusion, actually a better representation of that is your mind's actually intimidating you. So you might feel confident. It can be stimulating your pleasure center about that, when in fact, it's intimidating you from consciously thinking accurately and coming to conclusions and giving boundaries to the gray area that would only help you tremendously. See, your mind will give you a good feeling when it perceives progress or the hope for progress, etc., right? Some form of good feeling. Here's the thing though. If your mind's understanding of progress or your mind's associations and model regarding progress is misaligned with reality, and by reality, I don't mean the physical world. I mean, whatever's really going on, whatever's really going to lead to progress and building blocks they can keep building towards more progress. Generally, people's minds' sense of what leads to progress is misaligned with reality. And that leads to an inevitable conflict where things that give you good feelings are mixed with things that give you bad feelings, because you feel like you're making progress when you're in reality not, and that catches up with you, and then you'll get to where you feel stuck and so forth. And this is going on with basically everyone, even I'm sure it still exists in my own mind too, but I rooted out a lot. I made improvements over the last decades with it very noticeable with massive benefit that why I want to share with you. So you get the same benefit. And I think people have been getting benefits over the years as me helping you. But that misalignment is the issue. And that's another huge thing you can start to take away. But that distinction of the misalignment between what's encoded or associated in your mind right now mostly through its gray area process of figuring out what makes progress or encoding or associating what makes progress, that's misaligned with reality. It's partially aligned with reality, right? Or else you just go straight downhill and die. But it is misaligned. Again, so the trick in life, one way of looking at it is to get what your mind associates with progress, which is going to give you good feelings, with actual progress, which is going to continue to give you good feelings and not get mixed with bad feelings, not get mixed with being stuck. And a part of being stuck is when you're going against headwinds, right? And so forth. And this kind of mixed emotions and approach avoidance and so forth. The proper alignment can be achieved through this black and white process. There's plenty of life that will remain a gray area, but you can embrace the gray area process in its proper place, but it should be overall surrounded by the greater frame we call your foundationalism, and then further frames, even your frame for making money, and then a subframe for starting an online business, a subframe for value, for understanding value, which is the core concept when it comes to making money. And then you can divide that further into product, traffic, and conversion. For each of those sub things as well, you can have an overall frame that is developed through a black and white, clear thinking process, the method of accurate thinking that I've given in the past, and I'll go back over. Basically involves things like disproving the opposite, like showing how the opposite can't be true, right? Basing your understanding of the world being based in your consciousness field rather than in what you think of as the material world or reality, right? That's reversed, that you want to have it be the right way. But that's just an indication of what I'm talking about when I talk about the black and the white process of clear thinking. You want that to be the overall frame to dictate things. And then you can only dictate things so far because you're not all knowing. But it's enough. When you approach life that way, and then you embrace where there's a gray area, just like on this webinar, I have to embrace that what to say is a gray area, right? But the overall frame, I try to figure out as much black-white stuff as I can by the time the clock goes ding in the webinar. And I try to have something overall before I even say I'm going to do a webinar, right? And so forth. But you use the black and white to have your overall frame in life. And it's very possible, it's pretty much definite if you haven't done this with me previously, if we haven't succeeded previously in reversing this. But either we reverse this together or it's overwhelmingly likely that your overall sense of how to know what's true, what is true, what's basically going on in the world is, and like overall what processes leads to you use for life, right? Your process itself was figured out using a gray area process. It was approximated and it's wrong. And so it uses its own approximate association-based feedback, see what fits and works based process. Your mind has done to decide whether or not you have the right basic process for life. It's all kind of a circular chicken and egg issue, but it's not fully chicken and egg because you have a foothold. You already have and use a black and white process, but again, it's been dictated. You only get to do it in a little area until and unless you break out and you end up reversing the process by figuring out that you can use black and white thinking to figure out what I'm talking about right now. I'm helping you through it. I'm doing it with you. As you do that and you continue to do that, you'll hit a point sooner or later, maybe immediately, who knows, where you'll get, because of seeing how the opposite can't be, you'll get the overall frame for life, how it involves understanding process, right? These kind of core issues of how you interact with the world, mind, knowing, and stuff, measuring progress, understanding the world, that sort of thing. You can get that straight, right? You could figure out things like that scarcity is not the rule of the world, right? That the world does not consist of a static pie of good stuff that we have to squabble over. And if one has more, one has less, right? That sort of things you can root out and more. Again, you could figure out basic morality so that you're not constricted by all sorts of BS morality from culture, but that we're not overstepping morality, right? We have different cultures here listening, but there's still like a shared culture. Generally speaking, there's all sorts of things that, what do people have? Oh, I need to show up for Christmas dinner because my parents want me to, right? I'm not saying that's immoral to do, but it may or may not. It isn't like it's immoral. It's not immoral to think that, but it isn't immoral to not show up for Christmas at your family, right? Even though they might make you feel like it is. They might say, oh, it's your duty. Other people cannot tell you what your duty is. Neither can your country or the law or your parents or anyone. No one can tell you your duty. But people certainly talk and act as if, of course, they can, right? Of course, people tell you when you have jury duty, right? I got a lecture from the judge saying it was my duty that people died to make all this possible for me. And it was my duty to show up. But that's ridiculous. No one can tell me what my duty is, except that my duty is to not violate the property rights of others, right? And then I can know that by disproving the opposite, right? The opposite of property existing would be there is no property. If there's no property, then we have to say that lighting a person on fire is perfectly fine, rape, that any kind of theft, murder, it's all fine because there's no property. As soon as there is property, that means there has to be something that you can own. If there's something that you can own, then that can't be taken away from you just by two other people just deciding you don't own it, right? Or if the entire world could vote, and as long as it was unanimous, except for you, decide that you didn't own your right arm or didn't own money that you worked for. If that could make it not your property, then you wouldn't actually own property. Or property would be something you own unless everyone unanimously votes otherwise. But that exception would just be arbitrary and ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense to make that distinction. And we certainly wouldn't affirm that if we all voted unanimously to light solar on fire, and there's no other reason, just that it would all of a sudden be okay. We wouldn't affirm that, and neither the usual list. So voting couldn't do it. Even agreement with everyone else couldn't take away your property. That's how we understand that you do own property, because the opposite doesn't make any sense. But when it comes to other things like duty, if someone else could just tell you what your duty is, then anyone could enslave you however you want. You just get to tell you it's your duty to sleep with me or whatever. And then otherwise it'd have to be some parameters that we have to figure out if there was exceptions where someone could tell you your duty. But I can't come up with anything for that. It doesn't make any sense to me. Again, the exceptions would involve rights trades. If there's a contract, then we could say duty, but then it's not really duty. It just comes down to property rights. If I trade with you some of my property, my time, or I'm going to fix your roof or something, then I wouldn't need a separate word duty. We could just say we made a contract or I traded, and it's now your property, right? My labor or the right to have me fix your roof or whatever, if you pay me for it and we have an agreement, that is now your property, not mine. Okay. Those are all just examples of the black and white needs to be king. It needs to have absolute power over the gray area process, or in other words, in its own domain, it needs to reign supreme. And without this distinction, it will not. Without this distinction, people will figure something out using a black and white method, but then they'll go and they'll check their gray area process for validation. They'll ask other people what they think, or they'll just check their own feelings. And they might not call it feelings. They might think that they're using reason or rationality, right? But it all boils down to the same thing. Your mind can give you all sorts of justifications and reasons for conclusions. There's all kinds of experiments where I've mentioned in the past where for example, you can give people 4 identical pieces of fabric and ask them which they prefer. And if they have to choose one, they'll overwhelmingly choose, I think, the one they most recently looked at, if I remember it. Might be the first one. But then when you ask people, so obviously that's the only difference. Literally the only difference is the order in which they're shown. Everything else is identical. And so it could be there's no other reason that it could be why they would choose one in disproportionately. But then if you ask those people why they chose it, they won't say they picked randomly, right? Because the other thing they could say they picked random, but they won't say they picked randomly. And then they won't say because it's the most recent one I looked at. They'll give a different reason. It's more comfy or whatever. And there's a whole bunch of experiments that show the same thing. You can read books like I told you before, Subliminal or Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, or there's a book called Sway, S-W-A-Y. There's a whole genre of books talking about this type of thing. So the critical distinction today is the following, and then what we'll do to follow up, right? Then we're going to start to look at what the gray area process is made at. And that's going to be eye-opening because as we come to become familiar with the gray area process, we will demystify where our feelings, our conclusions, our justifications, even times we think we're using logic or reason rather than feelings. This comes up in politics a lot. Both sides think that the other side is just low information or just using their feelings or irrational, when in fact, commonly people are not using a black and white process, right? If they were, then every single one of them would realize that extortion with the taxation was just extortion renamed with absolutely no difference. The one difference would be the idea that government has the magical ability to make something immoral into something moral, which is also false. Once you dissolve those two things, then they would all conclude that like something like an elephant in the room, something as major as taxation. I mention it because it's such a huge part of life, right? It's so big that anyone who was actually thinking correctly or clearly in the arena of politics or government would all conclude that, of course, you fully eliminate that to start with. That's your basic starting point. That's your frame. Gray area stuff doesn't take precedence over that. And then you figure it out from there. Anyone who doesn't come to that conclusion isn't using any kind of process that we would want to say is accurate and effective. Whatever. You can't even spot the elephant in the room, then something you don't want to praise someone's vision, right? But the point is that both sides, looking at both sides, thinking that they're being reasonable. Oh, I see it nonstop is anywhere, not just in politics, all over the place. People think they're using reason when they're not. Okay, so as we become familiar with how the gray area process works, we'll also see why it makes us feel the way we do and so forth. It'll demystify the whole thing. That will lead, because I think that really the bottleneck is wondering whether that doubt, that intimidation of maybe the gray area process is onto something. It's totally valid. It totally is onto something in the gray area, but it's not onto something. It should have no purchase, no foothold, no leverage against things that you conclude using accurate thinking. Your overall frame needs to be dictated through the proper black and white process. So by having the distinction to start with of just a possibility of two things, I don't mean the distinction in the sense, a distinction does not mean if you can tell that lions are different than bears, that doesn't mean you know every property of lions and bears, right? So we can distinguish just the concept of a possibility of a black and white process versus a gray area process. And that doesn't mean that we don't have that distinction just because we don't know everything about the black and white process and the gray area process. You see what I'm saying? And there has to be a distinction because if there was only a gray area process in life, then you couldn't know anything. Of course, that statement itself is arrived at through black and white accurate thinking, right? Because anything to do with just showing how the opposite has to be wrong, and therefore the other opposite has to be right, is the proper usage of the black and white process. But if the gray area process was the only thing, then we wouldn't be able to know anything. Everything would dissolve into absurdity. So there has to be some other process. Once we start to make this distinction, but then, as I said, as we're going to explore the gray area process, I think that'll, in practically speaking, that's really going to clear things up for you tremendously. Because the black and white process is not that hard to do or understand. You already do it. The problem is not distinguishing it, having it be intimidated. Basically, the intimidation comes from it gets swamped out by the gray area process because they're all in the same category. When you have everything in one box, then you can overwhelm one thing with another because they're all in the same box. If they're in two different boxes, it doesn't matter how much is in one box. The other box is still clear and it doesn't overwhelm the other box. go to the other slide. What did I say here? And I said this, each is great at the right time and very problematic at the wrong time. You can boil down all your problems in life or you can boil down the secret to success to this, distinguishing and developing understanding where you can fully distinguish. The more fully you can distinguish, the more you're going to actually have success given your situation. Someone else might look like in a certain area, they're having faster and more success than you because they already have a head start or a talent, or they happened upon the right recipe and so forth. Obviously, people can get rich without seeing this, right? However, you will make more money than you yourself otherwise would if you can distinguish this up and until the point when money wouldn't help you anyway, right? You will optimize your money situation and every other situation, your romantic situation, your relationships, your health, whatever, by in your own life, comparing you to you, by increasing your understanding of this distinction right here will be an efficient and effective way to progress and everything else in life for life. It's about the most efficient thing you can do in general, especially given that you have me to help you anyway. But I recognized years ago that something to do with that distinction was where it would be efficient to focus. And it turns out that even though I had to figure it all out, it was still massively efficient for me. And I have basically everything I want in every area of life, or some things I might be working on, but I get them by accomplishing other priorities and so forth. Let's think about the problems your mind has in trying to navigate the world. Let me come back to that. Let me just point this out here to the extent that it's helpful. It might seem like a tangent, but it all relates. It relates to this idea of context by national frame. First of all, let me skip to the bottom here. Let me just ask you, your own just usage of the word strategy and strategist. If you took someone who's a moron, and I'm not being condescending when I say, I'm not even saying there's an actual moron, I'm just saying hypothetically, suppose there was someone that you yourself would consider basically a moron. All right. And if you gave them the right recipe for something, ranking in search engines or making a cake or succeeding in a sport that you had the aptitude for it, and then they followed that recipe. Now, let me point out that if somebody succeeds at something, we tend to look at that success and say, wow, you used great strategy there in many cases, right? Okay. However, what we really mean is your recipe was good, but we don't necessarily know if they're a great strategist because they might have just happened upon that recipe in a way that they don't really deserve credit for, so to speak, or it wasn't really a strategic thing. They just got handed it somehow or happened upon it. So, and then I'm just asking you yourself, and I'm not even saying there's a right answer to this, but probably you would affirm that if a moron with the right recipe, I wouldn't call that moron a great strategist. I would just want to say that he has a talent or he or she has a talent or had a good recipe. Because actually, so what I'm showing you there is that we probably want to have a distinction where we don't just call something good strategy because they have a good recipe, we'd want to call that a good recipe, right? Because there's two concepts here. Because there's a different concept, which is, and this will tend to relate to process. This is just another way of looking at process. Is you're trying to achieve a result, right? Including perhaps being happy as well, but they're all tied together like I talked about. If as soon as you are trying to achieve a result with limited resources, which is true in some cases, there's some resources that perhaps might be unlimited, and then there's some that are limited. Whatever you're doing with limited resources, that's when strategy becomes relevant. If someone had an unlimited amount of money somehow and they threw it all at a problem and they solved it, we wouldn't necessarily say they used great strategy either, right? So I'm just pointing out what we're getting at when we think about strategy in actuality. We're really thinking about you have a person and they had limited resources, but they managed to, and they didn't just get handed the right recipe, but they figured it all out by using a process. So they had a good method process. And if we think about it, that means that if they have limited resources, then they have to choose alternative use of how to use those resources, which involves priorities, right? They had to prioritize the right resources, spending at the right time, which would involve understanding versus on bottleneck. They want to, right? If you're going to use the right resources at the right time and the right amount, then you want to understand those resources and you want to understand where the bottleneck is, right? In order to direct resources there. And then in order to do that, in order to understand resource and bottlenecks, you need to understand more about the context. Sometimes we can use the idea, the mental picture it might be abstract without a mental picture. One of our go-to mental pictures that we can often try is with invading a castle, right? You have an army you're besieging or otherwise trying to get into a castle and defeat the defenders, right, in medieval times. If you're doing that, you have limited resources with which to accomplish your objective, right? You don't have an unlimited number of men and guns and whatever, right? Presumably. So then you need to figure out what the obstacles, I could have put obstacles in here too. When I use the word bottleneck, I actually mean things like obstacles, or if you're running in circles and not realizing it, that sort of thing. My catch-all word for that. It's not a perfect word for that. And what resource you have available. In order to understand your resources and what the bottlenecks might be, you actually would need to presumably understand the greater context, and that would keep iterating. The more context you understood, the better, in order to better understand bottleneck and understand your resources, until you got to the greater foundational frame, at least for that topic, right? That whole endeavor. And really, it's going to keep turning out in life that if you don't understand the overall frame for life, which is the kind of thing we're talking about here in this webinar, right? Your overall idea of who you are and what the overall process is for identifying progress, which also can be reframed as this kind of strategy angle. So every time we start to think about these important terms, in this case, strategy, all these different things that relate to the core issue of life, we keep getting back to where we need to understand context, and then we need to get a sense of our overall frame. And so our overall frame would be understanding strategy. And so, okay, let's get to talking. I'll probably wind up my talking part maybe about 20 minutes, and then we'll continue in future webinars. But let's start talking about features of what you do when in dealing with gray areas, right, in life. I have a lot of thoughts and knowledge about this, so it's going to be a little bit of a jumble as we start. I wish it wasn't a jumble, but I wasn't able to keep it from being such, in essence, despite my preparation. A couple of things that kind of formed a perfect storm for me coming to understand this stuff was I was interested in learning, right? Accelerated learning, which means I realized that in order to understand how to learn fast, just like in order to understand how to make money, you want to understand how to do it well, right? How to learn it efficiently, effectively. In other words, in order to learn fast, you basically just need to learn how learning works, right? So understanding learning is actually the same thing as accelerated learning. When I say that I taught a course for 10 years on accelerated learning, really what that meant was I was focused on understanding about how learning works. Learning is involved or can help us to understand gray area type stuff, or give us part of the context or backdrop. The main thing that's going on as an effective learning in your mind is associations or form, right? Now, I've separately talked about how when it comes to actual truth, then what that means is that one thing matches another thing. When it comes to learning, however, you actually need to associate stuff. And let's think about learning a language, either your first language or a foreign language. If you take obviously when someone's learning their first language, they're a child, right? A young child. So you point to a tree and you say tree. And what the child is going to do is associate those two things, right? The word tree with the object, we would say, right? And the word would involve something auditory at that point, and then separately they might learn to write or read, TRE, right? The written letters. Now, the written word tree, the letters, the sound tree, and the object tree, and there's also not even just an object, but then there's a mental idea, an archetypical composite, right, in someone's mind of tree, right? So there's not just tree as one object sitting there, but there's a concept, right? In each of those cases, none of them match the other. They're all associated with the other correctly, or in a useful way, right? It's certainly useful to be able to talk using language, right? But do you notice that if you write the word tree, that doesn't match the sound? It's associated with the sound, but they don't match. And certainly, and it doesn't match the object, and it doesn't match the kind of archetype or idea of tree that might form in your mind, and that your mind uses all kinds of processes about trees. So none of that matches, but it's learned as an association. If your mind prioritized matching, then it would basically block all learning. You see, so truth needs to be ignored as a concept because the only meaning of truth, there's two practical things that truth refers to. So truth can be a category that's associated with all sorts of ideas. And that's what it is. To your mind, truth, again, is like a category that is, something is true if it's associated in your mind as true. It doesn't mean that it actually is true. Of course, it's the case that, at least with other people, there's things that they would affirm that are true. And probably there's some point in your past or whatever that there's things that you've thought were true when they're not, right? So that association in your mind is not the same thing as actual truth. And almost nobody, I would guess, could even give the real meaning that truth has to refer to, which has to do with two things matching truly, perfectly, exactly. It'll turn out, I'll investigate this at a different time with you, but we'll explore that and you'll come to see that's what truth has to mean. Any other meaning kind of dissolves into absurdity or nothingness as far as I can tell. Again, we can look at that more closely at a different time. Totally important idea to get. But what important for now is to realize that your mind, as it's learning language, as an example, and learning lots of other stuff, but as it's learning about the world and how to navigate it and how to survive and thrive and so forth, and including how to get along with people, right? It needs to follow a process other than one that has to do with actual truth, which has to do with matching. It's associating, it's not matching. And also it needs to make guesses about all sorts of things that can't be known perfectly. So you can't know that when you're a baby, that the next time you drink milk, you can't know now that when you eat food or step out of your house, you're not going to fall off, in the case of stepping out outside your house, you're not going to fall off a cliff a mile down and die, right? But in order to not starve and to navigate the world in other ways, you need to act on the idea that it's true that you're not going to do that. Or at least you need to act on, you don't have to act on the idea that it's true, but you have to act on the idea as if it were true. Right? Or to drive and get coffee, you have to act on the idea that the place is open and still exists where it is, your car is going to work, your brakes will work, all sorts. So you're acting on it in the absence of knowing, and that's totally appropriate. But we want to have a category or a distinction for that sort of thing that isn't the same category as things that can be known as true in a different way, in a black and white way. We're operating in a gray area world in a lot of cases, especially as we interact with the physical world. We constantly don't know for sure the sun's going to rise tomorrow, or we make plans where it's going to benefit us in a year or 15 years. You put money in an IRA, right, a retirement account or whatever, then you're buying less stuff now in order to have stuff 20 years from now. We don't know we're going to live that long, but it's still perfectly reasonable to act on that. Right? It's a gray area, but we can know that it's a reasonable way to act. As I continue here, we're going to differentiate. Even again, what's going to keep happening is even as we operate in a gray area, there's black and white things we can know that frame how we act in the gray area. So there's aspects of putting money in an IRA that when I say you can know that are right, you can, within a certain context, you can know that it's right. I'm not saying that for everyone, it's always true that you should put money in an IRA. But for example, with an IRA, if we, for starters, we can stipulate it, then we can see from there. But if we're saying, all right, I need to earn money. Do I just need to earn money for today? No. I want to also, it matters to me to be able to know that I can eat next week and then I can pay rent next month. Should it matter? Sure. It's not obvious. What would it mean if I didn't care about 5 minutes from now? That would be absurd. Or 1 day from now or a week, even though I can't know for sure then, but not taking that into account because it's certainly a possibility, right? As a matter of fact, if you look at how you would act if you didn't take into account the near future, then you'd run into all sorts of problems that are pretty obvious. And then we could carry that out and say, all right, what if I planned out my money so that I took care of my whole life as reasonably foreseeable? How would that compare to if I didn't? Or if we might say, right now I act as if money is important in a way that I allow other people's priorities, right? In order to make money, you basically have to prioritize other people's perceived value over your own. You might get lucky and not do that, but basically you're not going to get that lucky. You can, people claim that they have or do, but in reality, they ignore all the times when they're just not doing that and not paying attention. And then so you might say, I don't necessarily want other people's priorities to take precedence over my own in a way that I'm not choosing it. And the minute you choose it, then people's priorities, now it's your priority anyway, right? So it might turn out that I can choose my own priorities and still make money, but you can't necessarily count on that, right? In order to count on it, you have to have money be a priority, right? In order to count on any result, there's a way that has to become a priority within a certain context. Trying to have two different priorities within the same box is another thing you could figure out. It's suboptimal. It's a bad way to maximize the gray area. So if you don't want to prioritize making money, then how would you get out of it? How would you make that possible? You could just make enough money that would support you for about a year, but then you'd obviously have to prioritize money again, not just in a year, but in whatever the run up would be to making money again. And so you might want to just have a plan to take care of it for your whole life. So anyway, that gives an indication of how you might start thinking things through. And then you might conclude about the IRA, because I got it as an example. But you don't know for sure whether you're going to live to a certain year or whatever. Sorry, I'm a little bit working in a gray area myself and explaining this for you here. So within the same topic, in this case, we're talking about an IRA. There's things you can know and there's things that you can't know. What you want to do is give precedence in terms of the overall frame to what you can know, and you build that. And then within what you can't know, then there's a different way to operate. And you let go, and you either, in the case of how long you're going to live, you'll mostly just let that happen, right? You mostly don't worry about it because you can't, you worry about what you can control and so forth. When you talk about what you control, again, you're dealing with what you can know. And then you're naturally, your mind, yourself, and you identify with it often, you're naturally going to operate. Okay, so the irony about maximizing how to operate in a gray area is all your conclusions about how to maximize it are going to be black and white ideas. They're all going to have to do with having boundaries, parameters, heuristics, like ways of operating that they themselves can be known. And then it's always the case that your mind is going to do the gray area thing. You basically are never doing that. Your mind does it all by itself always. And the only thing you can really do consciously is to boundary it off and maximize it with things you can actually figure out using the black and white method. Because we identify with our minds, or our minds identify themselves with us and give us thoughts and conclusions as if we were our mind, which is not us, and it's not conscious, then we think that we're doing stuff our mind is. So we think we need to get involved with the gray area stuff. That's when the advice, don't think, don't get in your own way, and so forth, actually makes sense. If you try to, ironically, if you interfere with, the way that you work with your mind consciously is by inhibiting it, which causes it to zoom in, see more in a certain area, but not in the place that's outside of where you zoom in. So the inhibition helps whenever it's done whenever it's correct, basically. Essentially, if you could control what someone else's focus, like what someone else is thinking about and looking at and the zoom of it, then when would that be helpful? Whenever you focus them in on something that actually was more important, right? Or that contained a distinction that was important that they weren't seeing. However, if you zoom their focus in on unimportant things or away from seeing things they needed to see, then you would screw them up. And so it's the same way with dealing with your mind, is a ripple effect of you getting involved consciously the ripple effect is where your mind ends up focusing. So you can actually screw it up if you get it wrong. The screw up wouldn't come from the correct method of black and white thinking. It wouldn't come from black and white thinking at all. It would come, what's going on? It would come from conclusions of this is where this second slide that I had, what came up as I'm talking here. And this is all fine. It might look like I'm fumbling around a little bit, but again, that's actually normal gray area behavior, and it should be what happens in a gray area. All right. So your mind had the problem of not having your black and white thinking developed and so forth. So it had to create a substitute for what you were supposed to do. In other words, it had to create its own epistemology, its own way of determining what's true and correct. That isn't equipped to do that properly. So your mind doing what you're supposed to do consciously, doing an approximation of it, is necessarily going to get screwed up and has gotten screwed up for you and for everyone else. So it trespasses on your domain, and you trespass and we're trespassing on its domain. You also do this with other people. By understanding on what I'm trying to tell you here, I'm able to set other people up for success really well because I don't interfere with them in a way that would mess them up. How you ever had a parent or boss or spouse or friend, whatever, that basically got in your way of poking around and discovering things and working on stuff, where they would be making suggestions or criticisms or judging in a way that inhibited you and kept you from taking the risks or poking around or trying things that you needed to try, right? That same type of thing people do back and forth with their own minds. And these two processes when they're used at the wrong time, in the wrong way, can particularly detrimental. So your mind had to create a substitute for black and white thinking, for determining what's true. It had to create a substitute epistemology to get you started. Again, epistemology is a process for deciding what's true. Whether or not to listen to your parents and when, right? Or other authority figures, or whether to go to college, deciding all this stuff with all your feelings and conclusions. Your mind has developed a substitute epistemology that feels by now very strong, probably very correct. Often you might not feel confident, but then sometimes you do feel confident. So it's trespassing in what should be your domain, and you need to build up the distinction and build up your domain properly, the black and white domain. But your mind had a problem because it needed you, so to speak, but you weren't really there. And it developed a system where it basically manipulates you with pleasure and pain and feeling, not just physical pleasure, pain, but like emotional and so forth. So when it thinks it's making progress, so to speak, right, it can't know if it's making progress because it can't know anything. But people think that they know all kinds of stuff that they don't. And then they think they can't know stuff that they can. And so it had to do this. And this is all part of me describing, as I continue to describe this process by showing you different angles and exploring it different ways. At first, the picture will be filled in and you'll want it to be. But as we fill it in, the feelings will lose power because you'll see where they're coming from, right? If you're sure that it's raining outside because it sounds like it was, and then you realize that, oh, that sound is coming from something else, and then you open the window and you see it's not raining, then that recategorizes things. So it's easy to let go of the conclusion that it's raining. As you continue to see how the gray area process works, it'll lose its power in the wrong way, and you'll be able to embrace it as you should in the right way. Such as with learning. Learning is such a good example, and I've talked about this in Crushing the Game, I think number 7, I think he came up as well, for those of you who have that. But with learning, what's interesting is that, like always, but it particularly is seeable in this way, you do want to create the conditions for learning, but then you need to get out of the way. Like you need to get, learning isn't like a black-white thing because you can't know. Well, once you can't know something, you want to get out of the way. You want to boundary it with what you can know. And so look there. But if you're busy trying to know things you can't, you end up inhibiting your mind from being efficient in the gray area. Your mind is incredibly efficient in the gray area. So learning, you want to create the conditions where what you want to learn feels important. And then mostly you just want to get out of the way. You want to just relax and enjoy and not be checking to see whether you already learned it constantly. And that's what people do is they read something and then do a check to see if they understood it. They call it understanding it, but whether they can repeat it or it all made sense yet and so forth. But it can't make sense yet because again, the mind's developing a framework and so forth. Just like with a child, you want to set them up. As I said before, my son is fluent in 3 languages and reasonably fluent in a 4th, which is Chinese, English, Russian, and Spanish he's quite fluent in. And he can read in all those 4 languages too. There's a funny thing where my wife was talking to the guy who we found who's great. We had to go through several people, but we found a guy who's great working with him with Chinese. And there was one day when he found out that Chance could also basically read to some degree in Chinese. And my wife said to him, yeah, but mostly he only reads pinyin, which is like a simplified form of the Chinese characters. And basically, he helped her to understand that was a crazy way of looking. Like Chinese kids typically can't even read. They learn to read the simplified version of 6 or 7. So the fact that he could only read pinyin was it goes to standards and norms and stuff. But how do we do that? There was a specific way we did it, and it was so counterintuitive that we had to go through several other people that spoke Chinese in order to get someone that would do what we said, which is we wanted someone to basically just mostly do what he wanted with him, not teach him lessons, not teach him the animals and the numbers over and over again, and to report progress. And basically my point here is that they weren't checking to see, testing him all the time and telling him what to do. The important thing was to create a context where it felt important. Here's a person who's fun, because fun to a young child is they play with what the child wants to do. Certainly to our son, someone that he likes is someone that basically does what he wants with him, of course. Not tells him what to do and pulls out lessons and makes him do lessons and making it a game doesn't matter. That's all BS, right? Basically, you want it to be something that they're interested in, they want to do. So here's a guy who comes and does what he wants, and he only speaks Chinese. That's the other critical thing is you must only speak Chinese. Instead, they would start speaking some English, and the minute they speak some English, it's all over. Because then anytime you want someone to speak English. So it needs to feel important, and then otherwise, just hang out with them. I don't only speak Chinese. But that's a practical, ultimate practical application of kind of illustrating. It won't fully explain what I'm talking about, but it shows how we create the boundaries that are going to be helpful. He likes the guy, and it's important because that's the only language he speaks. You need to have both of them. The person has to be likable, doing what Chance likes, and only talking Chinese. So that makes Chinese important rather than unimportant. If his name is William, if he also spoke English sometimes, the Chinese wouldn't be very important. In this case, likability and importance. We create those things you can figure out through black and white, clear thinking, are important frames or boundaries. That sets the overall frame. After that, get out of the way. And don't be trying to test him. Definitely he can correct him if he says something in Chinese and it's wrong. Within reason, he can correct it, just like I do in English. But I don't do it nonstop where he doesn't want to hang out with me anymore or like my son or anything close to it. That's not in much danger. And my son, Chance, he tends to like to learn stuff. So he's pretty good with being corrected at that age. Yeah. He doesn't take pride in already being right about stuff at that age. So they take correction a lot, typically. But they don't like being tested, typically. They'll like to show off when they want to, but not be tested. Testing them will actually interfere with learning. It's like trying to know things before the right time. That gives a bit of an illustration about that. See if there's anything else brief here. What I want to do, it looks like next time, is I want to take a look at how the mind will, and I maybe give a little indication here, and I've also touched on in the past, a lot of what this distinction will do that we're talking about here, this gray area versus black and white, it'll help us to organize a lot of what I've talked about in the past. In the gray area, what your mind will tend to do is take a look at, to figure out generally what to do in life, it'll take a look at what's normal, right? And it'll create norms. How should we compare to normal? Should we be much better than normal? Should we be about the same as normal? And that could change from topic to topic, right? You might want to fit in normally with how you dress, but be much better on certain sports or intellectual tests, right? But your mind judges that based on various other, it'll judge norms based on what looks like your peer group or the area or that you're in or what's going on around you nearly. And then standards might be based on certain self-image things often that come related to your parents or what other people approve of or don't approve of, right? And so forth. But it'll guess those two, basically kind of a hypothesis from norms and standards. And that's where goals come from. And then it judges progress based on, again, an approximate process of feedback. One way to identify that you're using a gray area process, and then you could think about whether it's the right time and the place for that, right area for that, is if you need feedback for something. If, for example, this happens with confidence. Someone thinks, oh, I need confidence in order to make sales. But then in order to make confidence, they're in a gray area. They don't know if they should be confident about themselves. And therefore, they need feedback that they're doing well. The problem is the minute you need feedback, that implies that you don't know. And that's going to undermine your confidence anyway. Plus, it opens you up to negative feedback. It basically sets you up for failure from a number of different directions if you have that kind of process. But that's a very common thing, right? Where with any kind of sales type situation, including relationship type stuff, dating, but also even in business relationships, you might not think of it as sales, but you're often selling people on your ideas, working with you, continuing to work with you, respect you, right? All that kind of stuff. People have a sense that confidence is necessary for that, which may be right, but then they'll go about getting their confidence using a gray area type of method. Instead, it turns out you can build confidence through black and white understandings of things. For example, you can have an overall understanding of this process we're talking about, including this gray area versus black and white, distinction plus understanding the properties of both and how they both function well in their own place, when and where to use them properly. Understanding this whole thing I'm talking about can actually give you a great feeling of confidence that's infectious and that will not go anywhere. It's not subject to feedback. And it doesn't imply you don't know it, because you actually can have confidence based on knowledge, including the knowledge of why you should be confident for a good reason. And that will help you tremendously with your sales and with all your relationships greatly, because all that stuff related to feedback for your confidence greatly undermines relationships in all sorts of ways. Makes people sense that you need only positive feedback, so to speak. But then they won't want to correct you, which means you'll tend to be more arrogant. Because people won't correct you, because people will believe that you won't take correction, which means they'll believe that you're basically arrogant because they boil down to about the same type of thing, right? And then their belief in you being arrogant will reinforce arrogance. Plus, you'll want to believe that you're great, even though you can't know it because you don't know how to know it, which is also going to lead to a sense of arrogance. And you're also going to come across as needy emotionally. And none of these might be extreme. Most everyone has this problem. So it's common. And so people still have some sort of relationships. But boy, if you operate differently, with understanding confidence differently, like I'm indicating, then it's extraordinarily good for relationships. And again, you get so many benefits in so many ways. People sense something different about you, right? You have a more core confidence. Then not only do they respect that, but they want to be like that. And so they want to be around you just to absorb more about how to be like. Plus they can make suggestions or talk to you more honestly, which leads to but not only a close relationship, but you have a better understanding of them. So even though another person's always going to be a gray area to some degree, there's also going to be things that you can know, make more, or smart to do rather than others, right? Sometimes you can't know something for sure, but you can know that it's a more reasonable guess, like the sun coming up tomorrow. And there's a way to know that for sure, that it's worth acting on that, believing in that. But you don't believe that it's true. A belief isn't a belief that it's true, as I've talked about in the past. That's a nonsense idea. To believe that something is true is a ridiculous understanding of the world. It's based on a fundamentally wrong epistemology. You just believe in the sense of that's what you act on. It's similar to stipulating, but relating to action. And there's always going to be a kind of short-sightedness to the measure of progress using gray area type stuff. So what you can do is you can work with that just fine by creating the right red flags, boundaries, you actually don't want to always be in flow, which is a gray area process, but it's kind of upset that you're unblocked in a gray area process. If you're always in flow, you're never using black and white, the black and white thinking process that needs to frame and boundary and correct the gray area. A gray area process will predictably get stuck in various ways. When you understand the right place to use the two different ways, the gray and black and white, then you'll no longer even need to, being stuck will always be a temporary thing, which means you're not actually stuck. Stuck will take on a different meaning. It no longer actually means basically, it just means that it's in need of the black and white process, right? You don't get upset if you have a robot vacuum, right, that gets stuck in a certain way and beeps. You just you just know how to unstick it. And et cetera, as I continue in future webinars. The more we explore this, the more it'll clear up so many mysteries of life and things that were wrong and ways that you're inefficient with your own mind or trusting your feelings in the wrong way and learning how to align your feelings with what's correct and helpful, and that gets more and more aligned, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that started to give you some context and some useful things to start with, and then some indication of how we can continue in the future. And there we have it for the monologue portion, so to speak. I'll talk for a little while with you guys in discussion, and then we'll be done. I'm switching to OMG here. We take a 1 minute break, and then I'll come and talk to you guys. One moment, guys. Okay, we're back. Put the camera back on. All right. Okay, guys, great. And I want to stress that there's plenty I want to share about this. There's so much I couldn't get to. And, but in order to explain things, I need to explain the context around it. And so, of course, all of this is such a new way of thinking in general. We're coming into this not having the context. And even to the extent that you do have the context, we don't have a lot of shared experience talking about it and so forth. That's why I have to talk and not always seem totally structured and so forth. But I do the best I can, literally, by at least spending a lot of time preparing. 1 second, I'm just going to sneeze. Maybe a bit of a sneeze false alarm there. Okay, let's see. Daniel says, okay, I'm starting to understand it. Thinking back, I was taking the gray areas for granted and imagined a mountain impossible to climb. Of course, I would stop pursuing a goal because I was applying the same processes in the black and white areas. Such a blind spot, I never saw it. Yeah, a lot of stuff is going to start making sense. Like, you wouldn't believe how many tie-ins I have to things that you experience in life, to success philosophy statement. Like, again, even things like when they say don't think, just take action. That's both right and wrong. It's correct when it's a gray area thing, and it's incorrect. But again, a topic is not a gray area topic or not typically. There's going to be plenty of things you can typically know. And even as you start to build on what you know, or start to notice some things you can know about a task or an endeavor or a goal or a topic. Then when you realize one thing by disproving the opposite and such, then it'll often reveal another thing, start to help you reveal another thing and so forth. But then you kind of let go in the gray area. There's a certain thing with feedback where there's a time and a place for feedback, and there's a time and a place where feedback is counterproductive and needing it is counterproductive. And I'll look to describe that better too over time. Right. You can't trust the mind at times. And the trick is to understand how that all works, right? Because it doesn't help just to try to, like when people have that, like when you say, don't make assumptions or question authority. The problem is you can't operate without making assumptions, right? And so we need to have an understanding of how to do that. Can I see the last slide, please? Let me see here. Just show my actual whole screen. All right. Oh, here is this gray area related concepts. Yeah. And these are kind of notes for myself, but you can write it down. I can even show you the other slide, the black and white related concept slide, just for future reference. Oh, there'll be a replay of this, so you can pause it and on the replay. And the replay will even be ready via registration link within an hour or two. I'll make it available. And so I'll put the other screen on that I didn't even talk about. But I've talked about a lot of this stuff in the past. It isn't so much that we don't know how to think black and white, but we don't, in a certain way. Walk with understanding. People have to understand consciousness field for sure. And then not matching and truth as matching. So there's definitely some things we need to know about it. But then the other problem is once I explain it all, people are still blocked by by not having a distinct box for this, and it gets confused with kind of fake starter kit epistemology that your brain made for you using gray area type of thinking. And it was good to help get you going, but it should never take precedence over something you figure out properly. It doesn't matter how nice somebody seems. If they're fundamentally an extortionist, then you at least need to understand that the extortion part of it is wrong. And if it's true, that no matter how nice someone is, if they were a serial child molester, you wouldn't do certain things with them or have your kids hang out with them or learn from them, then there's no important difference between extortion and child molestation. They're both extreme, practical things that happen in the world that can destroy, that have a tremendous ripple effect of destruction. Joseph said, this is a bam, smack, pow session. I love the distinction between a recipe and a strategy. Oh, good. I'm glad that strategy slide is a little bit of a different angle there. Almost like an interruption in one sense, but I had it in there, so I thought I'd give that to you for a different angle. Sulaine says, is it correct to say that in the black and white process, we need to seek matching, whereas in the gray process, we do fitting and know that we can't know for sure? Basically, that is correct. Yeah. And what you want to do when something, especially if you say in the black process, we seek matching, but really what you're seeking is not matching. Because when you seek, it can perhaps collapse when something's super simple, but even something super simple is always going to be in a greater context of life that you'd have to know that and so forth. So I would say you seek not matching. You got to show how the opposite is not true or where a distinction. What I like about the gray area versus black and white is it's two opposites. Instead of saying successive approximation versus constructed or something where it's not clear what the opposites are. So in black and white, we want to seek like not matching distinction opposites. In the gray process, you are looking, now you maximize it. Ironically, this is going to be confusing for a little while, or at least maybe it won't be, but watch out for it. But my talking about the scientific method thing is a good illustration of we maximize the gray process through thinking about it and delineating it and bounding it off and having processes and heuristics that are discovered black and white through black and white thing by making distinctions, seeing how the opposite would make sense to do and the opposite of boundary wouldn't make sense and so forth. So like with my son, when I said mostly with the gray process, you're letting go. You'll notice that what's happening is fitting or getting feedback from the world and so forth. But so you mostly let go and let it happen. And that's when your mind gives you a pleasurable state, like called flow state, when it is just doing its own process and it's set up to do it where it's not stuck, then you'll tend to like it. The guy who wrote the book on that, right? Mihail. It's a long, complicated name. I think I'm pronouncing it roughly correct. But the book is called Flow. He concluded, because his epistemology is the same as other people, that kind of the meaning of life is to get into flow state. Because flow state, people live longer. People are in flow a lot. They're happier and so forth. But that is missing the big picture. You can, as I say before, you can flow right off a cliff, right, or off a waterfall or something, flowing along in a boat happily. But yeah, the gray process does involve fitting. And when things fit or seem to fit, you don't want to affirm that they're true. You just affirm that it seems to fit. You don't want to use ideas like, you're not looking for certainty within gray area. You're looking for what works, what's reasonable, things like that. What's interesting is you're going to find out that what's reasonable, there's at least an aspect of that you figure out through black and white thinking. I alluded to that earlier. You can know that something's reasonable without knowing for sure what will actually happen. Sometimes someone that I know might suggest, hey, this person's not a good person. They're a bad person to work with, or we don't want them in our community. And I'll understand that I don't know that. It might seem that way or not early on, and I realize I might never will, but it's reasonable often to give someone more time up until a point when it becomes particularly clear, right? Because the cost of trying to nip something in the bud, see what people are really trying to do often when they're trying to like judge a person, like size up a person quickly, they're really just trying to make progress in the sense of liking themselves, right? Their own standard or norm, right? I'll be able to, using this gray area, black and white area distinction, I'll be able to develop more about what I mean by letting go of the goal of liking yourself. That's much time I had in the past because it's such a massive inefficiency. And one of the things I wanted to say, there's a lot I wanted to say, but this is something that's so cool that I want to say it now is, let me see if I have a slide on this. I might not have one here. No. Crap. Okay. So what I wanted to say is that, okay, in a gray area, your mind is constantly making associations, again, as if they're true. We want to boundary things by excluding the idea of truth from associations and operating in the gray area. That just because our mind associates something as true doesn't make it true. Our mind generally associates something as true, either if a approved source says it's true, like an authority figure or something, or if it tends to, without us putting it in these terms, it'll form a hypothesis, an expectation, right? Learning has to do with forming expectations, and then first it perceives and then forms an expectation of what it thinks will happen. And then if that expectation is met, then it'll get hardened as an association. And then it'll at some point be coded as that's true. Like that's going to happen. But it's, of course, that's not a process that leads to correctness or certainty. It's just a way of navigating in a gray area when you don't know better than not. Anyway, here I'm getting to the fascinating part in a second. What'll happen is our mind will have an original end state or goal that it'll come up with. And let's stipulate for a moment that goal is worthwhile, making a certain amount of money or fitting that. One of our earliest kind of things is, well, there's a logical chain, but in terms of getting its needs met for a baby, it'll need to have the approval or the social regard of the people around it, right? Especially probably in early years, not just like when a baby is really little, it won't think in those terms. It'll just have its needs met and it won't be associated with how it behaves, right? But then as a child grows up a little bit, then it'll associate approval from its people around it, parents and anyone else that's around, as an important way to get its needs met. But then what'll happen is that the association that's associated with progress or whatever, it's something like a certain type of progress or seeming progress is associated with the end state or end goal. But what happens is with this successive approximation, this gray area process or successive association, we might even call it. And hear me on this because this will be very important for you right now to recognize and help you with your money getting right away. Everything. The progress, in this case, getting approval from people around us as an example, but it's a poignant example because that remains an issue for us as in adulthood and right now for all of us. But that's just one example of the overall thing that's going on, which is the goal actually get lost. It's basically not associated up because there's an intermediate association, that progress step of, in this case, approval. So let's say we want to get fed, all right, get our needs met with being fed. Then in order to do that, if the approval or high regard of the people around us seems to help with that, then what'll happen is the end goal will actually basically get forgotten in terms of the neural association, practically speaking, because there'll be an intermediate association that'll get formed that'll end up taking precedence, right? Because once you create like an intermediate step, it'll kind of end up losing the strength of the later association will tend to atrophy. So that more immediate association to progress, which may or may not be real progress, it may not be relevant later in life or in a different context, right? The problem with these associations is they end up being reasoning by analogy because the association will remain even in a different context when it might no longer apply. And this is a huge issue we have all over the place in our minds, is we have these associations that are no longer adaptive, but the mind doesn't know that or realize it or it doesn't act on it. Another way to put it, knowing it is irrelevant, but it doesn't change the association necessarily. It can over time, but it may or may not realize, it may not have a feedback that will help it to deal with that. And generally this approval thing as an example, but two things are vitally important here. One is the specific instance or example, and the other is the meta process. They're both critical for you to understand for right now. But they're both very important right for you right now in your online business and all your other endeavors in a very practical way. So again, both the specific instance example I'm giving you is probably still active in your life, and the meta process is still active and has spit up other instances. And what that is, that the thing that's associated with progress ends up taking precedence and replacing the end goal. And this is what happens in virtually every institution, like government, schools, corporations, whatever, charities, right? They end up with the thing that's associated with short-term progress ends up acting as if it's the end goal, practically speaking. The end goal might still be written somewhere in the mission statement, credo, or be used for marketing purposes, but it no longer has power, basically. It's no longer being acted upon because that short-term progress, because of how this gray area process works in people's minds, the short-term progress takes precedence. And people act as if the goal now is the thing that got associated with progress. And this type of thing is messing with you in a zillion ways in your life. And the approval thing is a huge example. Like people say that Harvey Weinstein wanted power. I'll bet you that much like Clinton and a zillion other people, I'll bet you that what's even more accurate is he wanted approval. And he didn't even really realize it. He just would feel a feeling of approval, and he would feel more approval from an attractive woman than from he didn't view as attractive, like approval. And lots of men fall into this trap. And that it's just the same process working, and people don't realize it's happening. And they just feel a feeling of progress from it. And so it drives them, and they don't even realize what's happening. Right. And they can base their whole life around it. And once you looked at Bill Clinton this way, it was obvious too. It drove all his decisions. Right. He wasn't really an ideologue that strongly about anything. But if you looked at what would have him get approval in a way that meant something to him, like approval is weighted based on the source, right? It's not the approval we get doesn't matter. It matters who approves of us, right? For a lot of us, or for a lot of people, like if a professor approves of their intelligence, it means more to them than if a bum on the street approves of their intelligence, right? Or, if there's just, I'm just picking examples. I'm not trying to create stereotypes in any way. It could be for either gender or whatever, but if there's a woman who wants to feel approval for her intelligence, then she's going to give more weight. She's going to want to date guys that she perceives as very intelligent, because probably that person will be able to give them more approval points by their own mind standards, implicitly, like subconsciously, right? Than someone that they don't respect or don't feel like is intelligent. That would work in my favor, right? When I was dating. Whereas there's all sorts of other ways that people want approval, or not want approval, but how they assign points to who's approving of them, right? It's going to be the same thing in business. You're going to have ways that you're going to feel like you're getting ahead if you get approval from the right people, right? That is what you wanted. And so this overall heuristic or way of operating, heuristic just means way of operating, where the thing associated with progress starts to take precedence over the end goal. You need to stay vigilant over that. And I've gotten so far by, like, I don't really have direct talents that I use for making money, unlike most people, right? Being able to have search engine optimization or something. I have a bit of an understanding of it, let's say accelerated learning, but really it's mostly this stuff I'm talking about here. But so much of what I do is I'm aware how things associated with progress take precedence over and replace the actual end goal, and take projects and businesses and relationships and everything off track nonstop. And this is happening not like beyond belief. It's leading to so much immediate inefficiency, probably in your own life too. It's incredible. It'll mess you up with sales, with everything, right? Where what you associate with progress is taking precedence over the actual end goal. And that also, what you associate with progress is also going to be what you associate with setbacks, right? And then you can see how that would affect with sales, is we're afraid to get told no because we associate that with a setback and so forth. When in fact, if you look at the context, which is a little bit different than the big picture, but the relevant context is a more accurate phrase than the big picture. Big picture kind of vague. It can mean the wrong things sometimes. But if you look at the relevant context, then obviously being comfortable with being rejected in whatever form that takes is going to be helpful for sales overall, including being comfortable with thinking about what happened rather than being defensive, right? Why the person didn't buy your product. And there could have been a reason that was good for both of you. It could have been just not a good match. But if it was a good match and they didn't see it, then why? So a huge benefit to this overall distinction of the gray area versus the black and white is this symptom of where the goal constantly gets lost. And institutions have this. It would happen to OMG. If I didn't stay vigilant over it, then short-term progress associated things would more and more take precedence over what we want overall, including even things like the easy one is like how much money we make next month versus how well we're set up for profit overall, plus people succeeding, right? 50% for people succeeding, 50% for profit, we might say. An actual profit that's net versus gross profit. Often what people want, they associate with progress is, again, approval, and look at approval as if they can quote big gross numbers. And so people talk about gross numbers. And it's amazing how bad businesses are, relatively speaking, at making net profit versus what they maybe could be. I've always kept my eye on net profit in terms of profit. Plus, of course, actually delivering what we say, which in our niche is not a given. In some niches, it's pretty easy to deliver on what you say, or it's at least if you just follow best practices, then you will deliver on what you say, right? If you follow best practices as a roofer, then you'll do fine. I don't know definitively on that, but let's say if you follow best practices in the niche of a program to help people make money, like our kind, then you're going to get what, 1%. I don't know what best practices even are, but basically 1% of people will succeed because recipes, right? Generally, people are selling recipes, right? Usually they're like a conversion-based recipe out of product conversion and traffic. They're generally selling a conversion recipe dressed up as a whole package. And it's really easy to make a sales webinar based on that. It can seem very educational, very interesting. You show, hey, look at this that I did. Can you spot what I did differently? Look how I switched this and it worked, and it feels really satisfying. I find that interesting too. And I'm not saying you shouldn't, but that's the best practice in our industry is selling a conversion recipe dressed up as a business in a box. And the thing with conversion, if you sell basically when you sell something based on conversion, conversion is very context dependent. So when things are context dependent, they tend to, fool is not the perfect word, but it will communicate what I mean pretty well. They'll tend to fool the gray area process. They will tend to seem much more valuable than they are, basically. So people's minds will perceive things that are context dependent, like recipes, like conversion recipes, tend to be very sensitive to context. So nearly everyone who buys a conversion recipe of some sort doesn't have long-term success with it. And most don't have short-term either, but they certainly don't have long-term. The very person who's selling the conversion recipe is generally not having long-term success with their conversion recipe, or else it wouldn't be worth selling it in most cases. But it's just conversion and sales are based on so many factors that have to do with a person's personality, context, what they're selling, the product itself, right? Usually you can't sell the exact same products. They're, again, very sensitive to context. And that's why nearly every product doesn't, even though it's legitimate, they're not scams at all. They're really not. I'm not even being critical. I'm just identifying what's happening. If you look instead at teaching the skill of search engine optimization, is that context dependent? Not nearly the same way. Basically, no. Basically, just about anyone who has a reasonable amount, I don't even know what, like pretty much anyone can follow a recipe of how to rank on search engines the way it was from Greg, Steven, Fletch, and Cotton, Joe. And it doesn't really matter what their personality is, their mindset, their background, their norms, their standards, what product they're doing, what niche. It's going to work for basically everyone, right? Especially because there's all kinds of keywords you go after. You don't have to nail every single one. So do you see, I picked something for OMG the very topic is context independent. And that's something I haven't described in that way before, but it's a major reason for our success. And I can't tell you how often people come and they say, oh, you can just apply your same formula. And they think I can leave out having a topic that is context dependent, or not like OMG, where our topic itself is context independent. That's critical for our niche, because if you give someone a recipe, which we do, and that's what people want to buy, and people need that, and it's valid to buy and sell a recipe of some sort, for sure. But if you do, it has to be context independent, right? Like gluten-free. God, there's such a funny video by, who's that hilarious guy? Shoot, forgetting his name. He talks about spiritual as hell. Yeah, does these parodies, right? What's his name? Starts with a J, I think. But if you look up on YouTube, how to become gluten intolerant or whatever. But anyhow, like a recipe that would help somebody who is actually naturally gluten intolerant, people have that happen and then they think, oh, this will help everybody. It won't necessarily help somebody who isn't gluten in anything like the same way. Perhaps. And maybe my science is off, and I certainly don't want to get in an argument with people about truth of something in the gray area. But the concept I'm illustrating, it illustrates the recipe. You want to give a recipe that's context independent if you're selling recipes, if you want it to help people, or you want it to give people the context to which it's going to help, and delineate that ahead of time. But if you sell something that's context dependent without realizing it, without explaining the overall context. And furthermore, in OMG, of course, we have law of implication. We have my stuff, which is the ultimate context, not just independent, which it is, but also will help you create the right context and frame around the recipe. So we do both for you. So that's a bunch of good, again, that the thing with that progress trap, where the associative nature of the gray area process will associate the thing, or take the thing that's associated with progress, end up acting as if that's the new goal, lose sight of the original goal, and that's predictable. That's going to basically happen all the time. And what you want to do is embrace that, in a sense. Like, you can even help to set up the feeling of progress properly ahead of time, but to either correct it and or embrace it, or both. And I do both of those in my part of what I do without people seeing it overtly in OMG, is I both try to make the feeling of progress, both for the partners and for the members in their own way, match up with actual progress, and furthermore to help keep people's eye on actual progress. Yeah, you can flow anywhere depending on your context, right? All kinds of bad stuff. Mike? Okay, Megan says, question about the process. You and Mike primarily choose to teach SEO over all the other possibilities for OMG by using your process and nailed it. In the same way, how to use the black and white process to choose, for example, a winning product to sell for e-commerce. What you do, let me remind everyone of something or clarify something. Almost every kind of general topic in life is going to involve an interplay between both the gray process and the black and white process. And that interplay involves boundarying off, right? Identifying or building what you can know. And then once you reach the limits of that, including for that day, you might not reach the limits overall, but you spend a reasonable amount of time, come to what you can come to. When I say reasonable, by the way, you can't even know how many minutes you should spend working on the black and white process versus letting the gray process play out, right? What's the gray area process? Basically, the scientific method is one good example. You can't know for sure what products might work well for e-commerce, for selling. There are some things you might be able to know for sure about what might be more likely, or so we're not going to conjecture about what that might be right now, but there's probably some heuristics and rules and guesses, things that can narrow things down for you, or at least be more probable. And then you let the gray area process go, and then you can become aware of what heuristics help with gray. So what helps with gray area is to be able to fail fast, right? But it's not failure, of course, at all. It's not framed that way. You're poking, and you embrace the poking process, right? Just if you're a door-to-door salesman knocking on doors, you don't try to figure out, unless there's if there's an accurate way to eliminate some houses from knocking, okay. But once there's not, you don't try to overly eliminate houses, you just knock. And you try to go through the process as efficiently as possible of where you get to a point when you really know whether that's going to be a sale or not, where it's a sweet spot of efficiency. So you're looking for a reasonable sweet spot for efficiency for testing products where you're spending some amount of money perhaps on paid ads, right? Generally testing may involve some paid ad stuff, although there may be certainly organic strategies as well. But you embrace the idea that, like when Tony Robbins says there's no failure, there's only feedback, then again, that's within the gray area process is that's basically the case, right? But as you understand more and more about, the more you understand about both processes and how they work, then you naturally understand, of course, there's no failure, there's only feedback when that's the case, when it's appropriate, right? It'll all reveal itself. You won't have to memorize a bunch of disparate rules. It'll just all come together into one cohesive model. It basically is that way in my mind, but it's to help transfer it over to your mind just takes talking. Right? There's not, okay, today we're going to cover lesson 1, and that consists of these 3 things and so forth. Just this is at least I'm not aware of that currently. So instead we do it like this. What questions would you ask? What scenarios would you run? What boundaries would I set? What you do first with a process like this is you realize that you don't really even have a framework to know how to maybe, like, you're looking for a process of like successor approximation. Like you're looking for a testing process that in and of itself is to be used in a gray area, but you don't even know what process to use, right? Often the meta process of what I'm telling you now. And then you use, so first you almost doesn't matter what you do with almost anything where you're starting new. Now, certainly you can follow a recipe like a Liz or Steven, depending on e-commerce or Amazon, and just do whatever, like work on what they tell you. That's totally reasonable. So you can certainly model someone. If you do model them, then I generally model them exactly, and I don't try to change things ahead of time. But it hardly matters what you do because any action you take when you're starting out will help give you new distinctions, questions to ask, a better backdrop and framework for like kind of any and all details can help you. That's like this webinar. Pretty much anything I say, given what I know and the preparation I did and so forth, is going to help because we're getting a kind of shared framework together. We're like, and it's having an awareness of that. People often think that's wrong or that they need to do things right out of the gate, that they at least need to be operating as if they know what they're doing, as if they know how to make progress and so forth right off the bat. But instead, I embrace the fact typically that I don't, and just to go from there. And then you get to a point where you do have a framework or a structure that emerges. And that's basically what I'd be doing. If I was doing this, I would, again, probably model somebody. But interesting thing is you hardly need to. Like it's a perfectly worthwhile thing to model. But if you're not in a rush, it's not even that critical, believe it or not. If you just try stuff for yourself first, that's also a valid way to do it. The modeling will basically accelerate you in some ways and cause you to be blind in other ways. And so when I say cause you to be blind, there's certain assumptions they'll make that'll get ingrained in your thinking, rightly or wrongly. You can't really go wrong. Whatever assumptions they're making, if they're successful, they're not enough to block them from just whatever they might be. And they might have 0 bad assumptions. I certainly have nothing in mind or else we'd correct them. Certainly with Stephen or Liz. I don't have the least thing in mind when I say that you can also try things on your own. If you do try things on your own, you'll actually value what they have to tell you even more in a certain way after you try things on your own. But again, it hardly matters as long as you are, a lot like with learning, it hardly matters what you do if you're like reading a chapter in chemistry for the first time of a new topic that's foreign to you. You could basically read it pretty quickly. And that in and of itself will help you develop a sense of what questions to ask, what's going on, right? And so forth. And then what you want to do is build in time to reflect and use black and white thinking on whatever that happened. Because pretty much any inputs will give you something to operate on with black and white thinking. Then given whatever inputs you got, there's certain things you can figure out, certain questions that are worth asking, certain distinctions you might notice, certain things you can eliminate, whatever it might be. And then after you reflect for a bit, maybe have some coffee or tea or whatever, have a notebook, then you can go take more action, model someone at that point, continue. But whatever it is, you just want to continue that process, and it'll become obvious to you if you're over time as we continue together, because dimensionality is all about understanding progress, how to identify it, how to make it, how to not be stuck. And so you'll more and more identify plans that aren't inherently involved being stuck by accident. Like I talked about with confidence, right? The normal way that people go about having a plan to make sales based on them being confident by succeeding first and making sales or otherwise getting approval, even if they don't make a sale. The other thing they might do is they might not make a sale, but they want to be approved of by the person they're trying to make the sale to, regardless of the sale. So that makes them timid in other ways, and because they just want that approval. Just like we do webinars for OMG to sell our main program, our No Holds Bar program. If first and foremost I want approval, then I won't do as good a job selling, because I'll instead just want people to tell me how great a webinar. And that won't necessarily align with keeping my real goal in mind, which is to sell the program, which is going to be what's going to cause the most actual success. Right. Or I'd change the program if that wasn't the case. Right. There's no way to really help people in a free webinar that much other than getting them to understand our program and see if it's a good fit for them. If it is. So that gives you some indications about that. But dimensionality is about the type of thing. So I'll think of more things to point out about the whole process. And pretty much everything about what we'll be talking will shed more light on this. But this is the type of thing I do all the time. So me describing my process. But again, I can't give you a recipe because that in the absence of giving you context is my point. I have to give you enough context that you have understanding of what we're talking about here. I wish it's always satisfying to give people a recipe that fits right in their life and work for everyone, but there isn't such a thing. I can give you I have given you recipes like the 4 perspectives, top down perspective, bottom up, front to back to front thinking. Adrian says, David, thanks for sharing your way of setting a chance up for learning Chinese. It's amazing you can speak those 4 languages. I've been struggling with learning for a long time. By the way, there's windows of opportunity sometimes. In the case of people and learning languages, there's a window of opportunity that closes at about 6 years old, where people, the mind, the brain, human brain works differently. As far as I know, of course, this is a bit of a gray area thing where it's scientific science, but it certainly fits. It's might as well act on this. So I was aware that there's the mind basically imprint building block in a different way before 6 or so, and around 6, and it starts to change a little bit. It's a bit of a continuum, but around 6, it doesn't imprint in the same way. Kids can still pick up languages at 12 easier than they can later. It doesn't mean that adults are bad at learning. It just is different. Like it has to do with that process, imprinting. And languages in particular it's really helpful to learn when you're real little. That's why we pushed it. I didn't try to push math. And when I say push, my idea of pushing is, again, creating a context that's smart, right? Same thing with reading, right? It's about flashcards, the mother being enthusiastic and having a ton of books around. We have a friend who says, my son isn't very interested in books, right? About the same age as Chance. And they have like only a couple of books, a few books in their house. And I don't think the mother enthusiastically read them in the same way, right? But when you have a zillion books around and Chance sees me reading, sees my wife reading, and we read to him, then obviously that's going to create context where he'll otherwise just learn and feel like reading is important. Learning to read is just a matter of being exposed to the words, the physically written words at that point. Weirdly simple. I've been struggling with learning for a long time. The harder I tried to work on learning, the slower the progress. Right, because when you're looking over learning consciously, you're actually inhibiting, ironically. It's particularly the case with learning also, probably practically speaking, it's the case with sleep, right? If you try to sleep consciously, you end up interfering with being able to sleep. Not everything is like that, but those things are like that. I basically only make progress when I give up in complete frustration. Looking forward to understand this better and get out of my brains when it's appropriate. Yeah, excellent. You want to understand that your brain can absolutely learn on its own without your help. However, obviously what you can need to do is create the conditions where you learn. Oh, think of learning a lot like keyword with Google. See, it's easy if you're describing search engine optimization to someone that doesn't know about it, it's easy to describe it in a way that doesn't really mention keywords. Just talks about Google decides who to rank based on an algorithm. They get points to you for different things, right? And penalize you for different things. And you leave out the idea you're also ranking for specific keywords. It's not just about ranking, but which keywords you rank for. In the same way, your mind has no problem learning. Everyone's mind can learn like freaking nuts. and have no problem with storage. There's two issues. One is with retrieval, and the other, but really what it comes down to is there's two bottlenecks. The retrieval, it's retrieval, not storage. Retrieval is a bottleneck because your mind can't associate everything with everything else, right? You can't remember. If learning is association, if it associates, if you think, what did I do yesterday? And you think of 5,000 things at once, then that's not helpful if there's something important you have to remember. Retrieve, right? So there's a retrieval bottleneck. And then, but the other bottleneck it's related ultimately is with importance, right? Once again, if you think about the world from the perspective of your mind is confronted with a vast array of input that it needs to make some order out of the chaos, and it needs to know what you want to retrieve later, or in essence, what you call it learning. And so it needs to decide what's important, basically. And so learning really is purely a matter of figuring out how to communicate to your mind or set up a context for your mind in which it decides that what you wanted to learn is important. Much like with Google, the keywords, you want the right Google to decide not just to rank you, but for those keywords. It's not maybe a perfect analogy, but there's two bottlenecks with Google, right? One is how many points you have in terms of ranking in general, like whether Google ranks you, and then what keywords it ranks you for. And so with learning, the issue is with retrieval, not storage. You have what amounts to infinite storage space in your mind. Your mind basically stores with wave functions. And so wave functions, the storage capacity of when it's based on wave functions is extraordinarily large. But you could store it, but the problem is getting it back out again. In order to get something back out again, if it's stored with a wave function, like an interference pattern of waves, is to shine the right wave back in to get the output back. So again, that's an issue. So again, it's retrieved from the wave function, the wave interference pattern, not storage. But again, you don't even really have to worry about the thing I said about retrieval very much. Practically speaking, if you figure out how to create the context to make the right information seem important, and figure out the factors for that, for your mind, then that's what's going to lead to learning. And then otherwise getting out of the way. David, thanks for sharing. Oh, okay, it's the same thing. Great. Fletch said, big distinction in context dependent versus context independent. Yeah, with the SEO and how we do SEO, and that's why there's so much success. We thought it was because Fletch is so dead sexy, and that's why there's so much success. But in addition to that, I'm not saying that's not the case and that doesn't help, but the fact that we teach something that's context independent for the most part versus a conversion boxed as a whole business, conversion funnel boxed as a business, that tends to be much more context dependent. Robbie Vaughn, if you like Big Bang Theory, you will probably like the IT crowd. Okay. Excellent. We would love something. I watched it with my wife and we love it, but we're currently finished with the seasons that are out on DVD, which sucks. JP Sears. Yeah, that's it. JP Sears was the one with the good one that's particularly funny, and there's some other. Yeah, he's a funny guy. He's gone pretty viral these days. Nathan, just constantly finding that the context matters more than we think by default. That's absolutely correct. Yeah, that's actually the first thing I said. And my first time I talked about law of implication was at the first OMG Live. And I talked about context and preparation and how by default context will seem less important than it really is. And Sun Tzu's Art of War, for example, can pretty much in one sense be boiled down to paying attention to contextual factors that people normally don't pay attention to. To that degree, it's very effective. Jason said, could school starting at 5 or 6 cause children en masse to change their desire to learn? Jason, school does start at 5 or 6. Do you mean making the decision to send your child to school, or am I misunderstanding? Absolutely. My understanding of learning, and not just learning isn't just learning facts, right? Learning is basically apprenticeship, right? You're basically absorbing what's important for the people around you. And so when you send a child to school, what they're really learning is they're really learning to set standards and norms based on the people around them, which is, I think of government as like an extortionist cult. It's actually it's a representation that actually fits just as well as people's representation or better. So you're basically setting someone to a cult recruiter for an extortion cult. And that's going to seem not only is that inherently detrimental, but that's going to be what they're going to learn is to value being a cult recruiter. The drop off in language learning at 6, but I still don't quite, I know I should understand your question, but I don't quite. Could school starting at 5 or 6 cause children in math to change their desire to learn? Oh, no, I think that it's biological from what I understand. And that would make some sense. The thing is, there's actually a trade-off. There's a certain type of called personality, but certain, um, I don't know how well I can describe this right now, but there's a certain filters that are necessary and beneficial that you want to have as you get older that a young child doesn't have. Those filters interfere with learning and imprinting, but you don't want anything to get imprinted on the mind. And so it wouldn't just be school. It would be a natural thing that God designed into people basically so they could learn language, basically their own language, because that's really helpful and important. But then you need the filter later because you actually don't want to learn whatever just gets imposed on you. You want to have a filter. That's why that filter actually, I'm glad you mentioned actually so I can explain. This helps me to explain furthermore why we naturally interfere with learning through our natural black and white process. Not even black and white. I shouldn't even just throw that around. There's even the gray area process has a filter. And it has an epistemology attached to it. It's like a stopgap. It's the best it can do for a gray area process. So it's not the black and white thing. Anyway, there's a filtering process with the mind that will interfere with learning and that's to defend you properly against having anything imprinted on your mind, but it interferes with learning. And knowing that opens the door into understanding more about how to help you learn. There's a bunch of stuff I know, as I said sometimes. And all of it takes context to explain it. It builds and it relates to some of the minds that John Bott. I could prepare for these webinars for a week, like spending hours a day. I end up with a lot of notes and not a lot of structure. But over time, at some point, I will get into the structure. It's all a natural part of the process. This certainly takes plenty of time. Like it's taken years, and I'm still not at a structure that I feel done with. But at some point, I will be. I think. Yes. Mike likes to talk about good night construction site as much as possible. Basically, the reason Chance can read is because of this book. A little bit, but he loved it. He liked the book very much. He's totally crazy about construction, and perhaps it came from that. But I think it was part of the whole loop with that. I think he liked the book because he loves construction. And we live in a good place for that. There's always construction there. It's like porn for 5-year-old boys. All these construction trucks and they stop. That's it. Megan Lee, thanks so much. The context you gave for this example is super helpful, clear and encouraging foothold about how to approach. Oh, I'm glad that was clear. I was quite. I always feel like sometimes so much comes to mind. I also do it by feel a little bit. It's a little hard for me to describe things, and I'm always working on it, of course. Trump roasting Bill Clinton. I'll have to. Not safe for work. I'll check that out later, Riley. Thank you. So I'll wrap things up in a moment here. Suleiman, David, you mentioned dimensionality is all about understanding progress. Yeah. This dimensionality series is going to be about understanding progress. I'm not saying the concept is or isn't, although in the meeting I'm giving you the concept that basically relates to progress for sure. I'm fascinated by the way you look at progress. Good. Stick with me. We'll keep going. Something triggered in my mind about the nature of progress itself. Is it relative or absolute? Is progress relative or absolute? There's probably two meanings, and it's both. There's a certain type of progress overall with understanding where it like my progress, for example, in understanding this stuff is going to be absolute in a sense of helping others understand it as well. Like understanding the nature of things is a sort of absolute progress, we could say. Could it be another man's regression? Only certainly is something that's actually associated in someone's brain. But ultimately in the world, it's not set up in a scarce way where one person having good means another person has to have bad. Now, of course, that can be set up of course, it currently exists in people's minds where things are associated with being good that the mind will get pleasure for. That'll hurt another person or reduce the pie for other people. That's, of course, the case. It does not have to be that way. And ultimately, the same exact person who got pleasure out of something that reduced the pie would be better off and have more pleasure overall and joy and everything by getting their associations aligned with things that cause progress. in a way that was aligned for their own life. And that's naturally aligned with what's going to help other people and be good fun. Even the simple idea of trade or creating things of value for other people, which is part of what we do, even in the perfect world, is create more goods. Then you would like it. You'd get good stuff from other people in trade, and they would get good stuff, and it's all aligned. There's nothing necessarily ingrained in the world that's counterproductive or scarce. But absolutely, by default or by not seeking understanding, that happens, and we need to create the context to get rid of that. Okay, guys, you are very welcome. I will continue to explain this stuff, but this overall distinction, whether you work on it for yourself, whether you have me help you, and so forth, is ultimately critical and important. So just by having it, regardless of how well I've done a good job explaining it for you in particular, everyone's mind is different, has different context and stuff. But working on it for yourself is going to yield great fruit and dividends for you. So that for sure, I helped you in a context independent way. And then hopefully I helped you with my attempts at explaining it to a greater or lesser degree. You're very welcome, Jason. Curiosity and appreciation, exactly. Anyone new that they haven't heard, it says a simplified, profound thing. You can pretty much react to anything and any feedback or anything, inputs in life with either curiosity or gratitude or both. That pretty much covers every useful reaction. Right? It's either what you already wanted and you can appreciate it, or it's what you wanted and you still want to be curious about how that happened, or there's some bad that you're seeing, that you're noticing associated with it, that you want to be curious about finding the contradiction that led to it. All right. You're very welcome, everyone. You're very welcome, Susanna. Cool. Got at least one person. Figure it's a great webinar. Appreciate it very much. Having fun that way. All righty. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. Great attendance today. Thanks for all your participation. As always, great discussion. And I will see you guys soon. Thanks, Mike. Oh, excellent. I'm glad it was better than I said. And then proceeding with Dimensionality, I'm going to have some terrific guests from within OMG. I think we'll get Mark Kirk. I think we'll get Jamie Washington back and some other people in mind. And we'll go from there. We'll talk about some applications with sales, with the online business, and also overall talking about ideas like this and expanding on what we talked about today as things unfold. Okay, guys, I will talk to you all soon.